Good evening, everyone, and a good morning to all those calling in from India. I'm Raju Rajagopal of Hindus for Human Rights. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's Desh-Videsh conversations, speaking across the divide. The topic for tonight is part two of Untold Stories from Kashmir. In part one, held on March 18th, we had focused on the situation of Kashmiri Pandits, both from inside Kashmir and in the diaspora. Tonight, our guests will bring you a sense of the ground reality for the majority community in Kashmir who are unable to directly speak to us tonight out of serious concerns for their own safety. We'll also hear about the ever-worsening situation for press freedoms in India. This is the fifth in the Desh-Videsh conversations, with the earlier ones focusing on the Citizenship Amendment Act that was titled Manufacturing Statelessness, the notorious UAPA, which was titled Curbing Terrorism or Stifling Dissent, and caste reservations. Have reservations about reservations? Question mark. We have an excellent panel tonight, but before I introduce them, a few housekeeping items. You may type in your question at any time by clicking Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, click on the three dots at the bottom and you may see the Q&A. Please keep your question short to the top on the topic, and please address it to a specific panelist or to all. Also, please no commentaries or personal comments. If a panelist chooses to respond to your question in writing, everyone will be able to see their response. After all the guests have spoken, we'll take up the remaining questions and seek a response from the panelists. You will not be able to use the chat feature in this webinar. At the end of the session, you will see a quick survey to get your feedback on this webinar, as well as your suggestions for future topics for Desh-Videsh. We would really appreciate it if you could take a few moments to complete the survey. Finally, all the views expressed by our speakers are their own. HFHR stance on Kashmir is clearly spelled out on our website. In our next Desh-Videsh hybrid webinar on June 9th, we are hoping to cover the ground situation in Uttar Pradesh with a personal appearance of activist Sandeep Pandey. Friends, without further ado, let me introduce our guest for tonight. Professor Ather Zia is a political anthropologist, poet, short fiction writer, and columnist. She's an associate professor at the Department of Anthropology and Gender Studies program at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley. Ather is the author of Resisting Disappearances, Military Occupation, and Women's Activism in Kashmir, which won the 2020 Gloria Anzaldúa Honorable Mention Award, 2021 Public Anthropologist Award, and Advocate of the Year Award 2021. She's been featured in the Feminist 2021, a list of 100 women from the Global South working on critical issues. She is a co-editor of Can You Hear Kashmiri Women Speak? Women Unlimited 2020, Resisting Occupation in Kashmir, published by University of Pennsylvania, and A Desolation Called Peace, published by HarperCollins. She has published a poetry collection, The Fame, and another collection is forthcoming. Ather's ethnographic poetry on Kashmir has won an award from the Society for Humanistic Anthropology. She's the founder editor of Kashmir Lit and is the founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, and an interdisciplinary network of scholars working on the Kashmir region. Ather is also a co-editor of Cultural Anthropology. Professor Zia will provide a historical background before she speaks about the current situation in the Kashmir Valley. She will also talk a little bit about the G20 preparations that are going on and being heavily publicized all over India. Prabodh Jamwal is editor of Kashmir Times since 1999, which is published from Jammu and Kashmir. He has been a journalist since 1983. He's also a peace activist and a human rights defender. He will share his views of the ground situation in Kashmir as he understands it, and will talk about some of the untold stories of Kashmir regarding its excellent human development markers, education, social safety net, etc., prior to the abrogation of Article 370, and what the post-370 outlook for the state looks like. Kalpana Sharma is a Mumbai-based journalist, editor, and writer. Currently freelance, she has worked with several Indian dailies including the Indian Express, the Times of India, and the Hindu, where she was a deputy editor and chief of the Mumbai bureau. In 1987, she received the Chameli Devi Jain Award for Outstanding Women Media Persons. She has written and edited several books of reportage from India, including Rediscovering Dharavi, which consists of reporting about Dharavi, a large slum city of Mumbai, India, and The Silence and the Storm, Narratives of Violence Against Women in India. Those of you who are following the state of press freedoms in India will immediately recognize her for her opinion pieces in outlets like the News Laundry. She'll speak to us tonight about the worsening situation for press freedoms in India in general and Kashmir in particular. Thank you all for being here. And let me pass the baton to Professor Ather Zia.
Thank you so much, Raju, for that introduction and gathering the panel together and re-inviting me to the panel because I could make the last one. So having said that, I mean, you did ask me to kind of give an idea of what I would be speaking about. I think I would like to speak about maybe the current scenario, a little bit about the history and the G20, and so not in particular order. So one of the things that I do want to highlight before moving on, this is about stories, untold stories from Kashmir. And as you have already mentioned, that this is about the majority community, so to speak, or the Muslims. I think it's symbolic in itself that there is only one person right now in this conversation who is representing the Muslims, so to speak, and that too, I'm not in Kashmir. So that in and of itself kind of gives us an idea of the kind of silencing. I wouldn't say that the Kashmiris are silent. They are silenced at the moment. And it's very important for us to know a couple of things, because what happens when we think about the current ruling dispensation in India, there's this idea that whatever is happening in Kashmir right now is sort of unique. But I think if we look at Kashmir's history, 1947 onwards, as the client politics began to unfold inside Kashmir, within the Indian Federation, what happens is that it's not new for Kashmiris to be censored. It's not new for Kashmiris to be self-regulated to a large extent for survival. It has happened right after 1947 that censorship was in effect. In fact, I think Kashmir is the only place where they actually had a rumor cell. It's not formally it's not formally documented, but there is lots of informal and anecdotal evidence that there used to be a rumor cell, which would kind of like circulate rumors and then kind of put events into kind of like circulate events. So the idea is that censorship is not new in Kashmir, but what has happened in this current dispensation, it's more or less institutionalized now. Early on, you had simple censorship laws, and then people would flout them, and then there would be some sort of punishment, persecution. But now it's institutionalized to such an extent that people can be stripped of their permissions as a journalist, their empanelment, and their advertisements as a publishing house. So it's kind of like written into law. So that's something that we need to understand, that whatever is happening in Kashmir post 2019 is settler colonialism on steroids. It's not as if things were not happening before, and not even 1989. 1989 is kind of this watershed because you see the armed resistance in response to the military aggression, which was not so openly seen, which was very camouflaged from 1947 onwards. So a lot of people kind of go back to 1989 and think about the armed resistance. Depending on which side you're on, it's called by many names. India calls it terrorism. Kashmiris call it Tehreek, or they call it, there's several names, but the idea is that it is part of the revolutionary process that Kashmir has had from 1947 onwards, and even before that. So the importance of categorization here is that there is no there's no difference between 1989 post and pre-1989, because for Kashmiris, there have been different phases in the kind of resistance that they have shown from 1947 onwards. And it's not as if Congress has been kinder, because Congress, as the secular party in India, in 2019, when the current dispensation stripped Kashmir of semi-autonomy militarily, unilaterally, and of course, undemocratically within what their own constitution is, one of the Congress ministers, he said that they didn't really need to be so spectacular about it, because we have done exactly the same thing 12 times and no one has come to know of it, because it's been so discreet, because it was done through the client politicians. And it's very important to have this terminology to kind of understand the pro-India politicians who are inside Kashmir from 1947 onwards, carrying India's water. So I think that's very important to understand, that for Kashmiris, it's kind of this continuation of discrimination, continuation of military aggression, continuation of occupation, continuation of settler colonialism in different camouflages. And what we see after 2019 is really this coming of age of this brazen settler colonialism and this extractive neoliberal necropolitical order that India has imposed on Kashmir. So having said that, I think we also need to understand that when we think about Kashmir's history, there's a sanctioned ignorance. And I'm talking about the Indian administered Kashmir. I like to call it Indian administered because that harkens back to the disputed nature. So and both of them can be called, the Azad Kashmir can be called Pakistan administered, and the one on the Indian, under Indian control and also occupied. So what we really need to understand on within the Indian narrative is that it's very easy for people to have this idea of like sanctioned ignorance on Kashmir, as if Kashmir had no identity of its own, as if Kashmir had no demand or aspiration of its own. And I'm not saying there was a blanket aspiration, but there was a majority aspiration of independence in the 1940s, when this movement actually starts and when the two nations are created. And then the idea of, the thinking about, there's a lot of trope of Pakistani aggression, of, now it's kind of come full fruition as what the Indian dispensation is doing with the resistance inside Kashmir, calling it terrorism, black and white. They don't call it militancy, they don't call it armed violence or anything like that. They just call it simple terrorism. And I think that's something that people need to engage with in order to understand why is it that Kashmir is always so restive. It's always not, and Kashmiris are not infantile people. It's infantilizing and it's paternalistic to every time say that something is instigated by Pakistan. So there are several questions that need to be asked. And one of them is, if we want to engage with history, first and foremost, I think where the critical Kashmir studies stands now, there is enough literature, enough documentation, enough evidence to kind of make us understand that whatever happened in 1947, we don't really need to answer each and every question as if what the fleeing ruler at that time and what the fleeing colonial power was doing with these areas. So we don't really need to go back and kind of like, think that it's kind of like set in stone and it's a law. But there are several valid questions about how is it that a fleeing ruler, the Hindu Maharaja, the Dogra ruler, how is it that he can sign off the entire area to India? And also there's contestation about his signatures and how, so I don't want to get into that, but the fact is that at that time, West Kashmir was liberated by 50,000 fighters who had been stripped of their arms by the monarch at that time. And those were leftover soldiers from World War II who had come back to Punch region. And they were joined by what was then created just then, Pakistan, and also the co-religionists who had come from the northwestern frontier provinces to help also with the Jammu massacre. And RSS is involved in that. RSS was underlining. So the massacre, the Jammu massacre that happened. So I think history, there's a sanctioned ignorance around that period, as if everything is black and white. And we really need to engage with that to understand where this restiveness, where this resistance comes from. And how is it that United Nations can come in and decide what to do with the region? And how is it that down the line, the two countries in 1971 can easily and arbitrarily change the name of the ceasefire line to line of control and kind of be okay with it? So all of these are historical questions, and I think they're very urgent questions. And the sanctioned ignorance that is really imposed on Kashmir's history, and also Kashmir's recent history, not just the 1947, 50s, and 70s. But what's happening in the 80s, what's happening in the 90s, there's a sanctioned ignorance as if it's just a proxy war, as if it's terrorism, quote unquote, or as if it's kind of only instigated by these, quote unquote, the stereotypical, which is the erroneous stereotype of Islamic terrorism, which is such a big misnomer. So it's not, so it's almost like infantilizing the Kashmiri population and kind of having this paternalistic attitude towards them as if they don't know any better. And let's think about G20. G20 is happening, and I know for the rest of the neoliberal states and the rest of the global economy, it's a good thing to have such an event happening in a certain place. But how do you have such an event that is based on 19 countries coming together in a disputed state? And if you look at the preparations that are happening for G20, it's almost, Kashmir is called as one of the biggest militarized open air prisons in the world, and also one of the most beautiful open air prisons in the world, because of the it's the size of Britain roughly, but the amount of army and soldiers that you have, if you kind of aggregate the entire area, it's the size of Dallas. And that's where these people are going to be having. How is it that the global polity, how is it that the global powers, and I know they're not themselves any, saints in this scenario. They themselves are necropolitical, neoliberal, capitalistic economies. If you think about US itself is a settler democracy. So that's the kind of democracy that is that's exported to the other regions. And India is no less a settler democracy itself, even to its own indigenous people within its own borders. So these are the countries that are meeting. But I think it begs the question, like, how is it possible when you have so many killings that have happened, more than 100,000, when you have so many disappearances, when even today there is, militants being killed, and it's in such a manner that there is no law that is, except law as a means of order, not as a means of justice that is imposed on Kashmir. And there is no Geneva Conventions, because if these are armed militants, armed combatants, and according to United Nations, it doesn't call it terrorism because it is a disputed region. It is sub judice, even if it's the kind of polity, the kind of the United Nations sort of negotiations that happen. Sometimes it's on the agenda, sometimes it's not on the agenda. But the fact is that it is on the agenda. How is it possible that you can kill these militants left, right, and center? And it's a policy of war. And Indian Army has gone on record to say that that's the best way that they can fight this invisible war, which is by just killing these ill-trained young juveniles, and mostly who are Kashmiris from the Indian held Kashmir. So how is it possible that you have such killings happening every day? You have detainments of journalists as we are speaking. Young people in hundreds have been detained for this G20, lest something might happen, lest there might be an attack. So which means it's not a normal situation. It is a disputed area where people are restive, where people are resistant. Even if the civilians are silent at the moment, they are silenced because there's so many laws that govern, that have been imposed on them unilaterally without asking, because they have no legislature at that moment, which I don't really count that much because it's client politics and that legislature comes from that. But at the same time, there is no law in Kashmir right now that has been executed by the will of some people. It's direct orders that come from New Delhi and that are imposed on Kashmir. And it's through that, what you see, the silencing of communities, not just journalists and not just defenders, but civilians. People cannot have a social media account where they can say something and not get suspended from their jobs. There's like examples of galore where people have just, liked a post and they have been either suspended or detained for some time, or some have been thrown out of their jobs. So it's not just the journalist community, it's not just the activist community, it's not just the intelligentsia who is silenced, who were writing, but it's just the regular people who have been also speaking. Very recently, there was I think it was a documentary or some sort of a program that The Wire had done, and it was asking these Kashmiris, like, how do you feel after 2019? And most of those people that were being asked, who were walking the roads, were silent. And the silence was very telling. It was very potent, because the kind of humiliation that Kashmiris have been made to undergo, the kind of silencing that has been imposed on them, and that is where the G20 is happening, in a disputed area, in an area where there are no civil rights, no human rights that the people can hold on to. I couldn't speak like this in Kashmir and not be facing any risk of different kinds of persecutions that happen. I think that's where I'll stop, and then we'll take some questions.
Thank you. We will take questions at the end of all the three presentations, if that's okay. So why don't we pass the baton to Prabodh?
Thank you, Raju. Thank you, everybody being here. I'm just taking to few points which I want to make in the background of the post August 5, 2019 situation, which has been described as very complex, and because of the reason that New Delhi decided to read down Article 370, Article 35A, and this was announced by the BJP-led NDA government before the elections in 2019, and they said they will be doing this thing with a big celebrations in a matter of another few months. So that has happened, and then they also introduced a bill in the parliament, in both the houses of the parliament, and it was passed as reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir, which also paved the way for bifurcation of Jammu and Kashmir state into two union territories of Jammu and Kashmir and a separate union territory for Ladakh region, which has a very small population, a big area like 60,000 square kilometers, and having a population of only 300,000 people. And at one point of time, they were demanding union territory status, but now I think the people in Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh are as confused and as disappointed what has happened post-2019 developments. And all the powers of the Constituent Assembly and the Jammu and Kashmir legislature were delegated to the governor and then to the lieutenant governor after 2019, October, that he has been taking all decisions, whatever was the outcome or whatever was happening at that point of time, because of the reason that he had delegated every power to himself for taking decisions about the fate of the people of Kashmir without consulting them or without hearing them. And that's a very unfortunate situation. And it's very difficult to say something at this point of time, like Dr. Ather Zia has pointed it out, that there is an enforced silence. There is nothing that is coming out of Kashmir. We do not know what is happening in Kashmir. Even if there's some incident is taking place, we don't get to hear for weeks together about what has happened, who has disappeared, who has been killed, or what has happened in a particular situation, in a particular region, or how the things are deteriorating so far law and order is concerned, or disappearances are concerned, or human rights violations are concerned, because there is no independent agency to say anything or any journalist to tell the stories. That is very unfortunate. And then I'll come back to the Article 370 and 35A. This has been challenged in the Supreme Court, but unfortunately, this is not being heard and a larger bench that was to be constituted by the Supreme Court has not happened for more than 3.5 years, despite the fact that a 5-judge bench in 1970s, early 1970s, had ruled that Article 370 is a permanent feature of the Constitution of Jammu and Kashmir. That was a very talked about case by Sampat Prakash versus Union of India. And I think many people who have a little bit of knowledge about what has happened and what were the developments in Jammu and Kashmir, they are in know of everything. Then what has happened? They had done the separate flag, the separate constitution that was just taken down and removed or eliminated with one stroke of pen. And then 35A, which provided a distinct identity to the people of Jammu and Kashmir, which is known as state subject permanent resident certificate. That has also been taken away, and it has been replaced by a domicile certificate, which is to provide certificates of residence to the people who have passed their 10th and 12th class of education in Jammu and Kashmir, or those people who have stayed here for 5 to 10 years. And there are some people who have stayed for more than 10 years. And everybody who has served in Jammu and Kashmir from this central pool is also being provided the domicile certificates. That is the design of the right-wing thinking parties, that how to change the demographic structure in Jammu and Kashmir, which is not that easy, but somehow they have issued 4.1 million domicile certificates as of July 2021. We do not have any figure, because there is no official figure available to us at present, how many more certificates have been issued. And it includes close to 60,000 people who were West Pakistani refugees, who were never given a state subject. That's a humanitarian issue which needed a humanitarian solution, I believe. And then there are people, about say close to 3,000 people who were Balmikis, the people who were brought in 1950s from Punjab for carrying out the Safai, what do you call, the cleanliness of the cities and other jobs. And there are about close to 800 Gurkhas of Nepali origin who were given these domicile certificates. But the figures do not say anything how many people who are from outside the state have been given the domicile certificates. And then the third most important point is that due to the introduction of new laws and repealing of the old laws, which provided some sort of safety, protection, and guarantee of services to the people of Jammu and Kashmir, they have been removed. And then what has happened? Most of the local officers, like every state in India has a local cadre, and they have a process like Public Service Commission in every state, which takes up the responsibility of conducting examinations and the selection of the people on the local cadre basis. Most of the officers have been sidelined from those responsibilities. Previously, it used to be like in a district, if there is a officer from either in the civil administration or in the police administration from outside, the other person would be a local person. But now this has been dumped to the complete extent. You do not find any local officer who can connect with the people in his own district, in his own subdivision or tehsil or downwards with the people and listen to their grievances and come to their you can say help or something like that, and then also get to know what is the local problem and how the officer can approach a problem and provide a simple solution, or listen to the grievances of the people. Similarly, the reservation in the professional colleges, that is on the agenda of the government to be fiddled with, but somehow I think it was unique to Jammu and Kashmir that for the last 35 years, 50% of the reservation has been provided, was provided to the women in every professional educational institutions, though I remember way back in 1988 when this was being legislated or was issued as an order by Farooq Abdullah government at that time. There was a lot of hue and cry because government did not adopt the due process in legislating the entire thing. This provided an empowerment tool to most people in Jammu and Kashmir, because now, as of today, because of these provisions, you will find more than 50% of the women as teachers, which is a very good sign, as also free education to the postgraduate level. You have empowerment of the people, and the JNK's Human Development Index has been far higher compared to rest of India. And that was a reason that we had a very skilled, knowledgeable human resource within the state, and we could compete with any best performing state within the country. And then after the abrogation of Article 370, they in the second anniversary, when they were trying to celebrate it in 2021, the government came out with a 76-page booklet titled Jammu and Kashmir Marching to a New Era, and that enlisting its achievements, that how they have eliminated 205 JNK laws and introduced 890 central laws, and about 130 state laws which have been modified, including taking the credit for Big Landed Estates Abolition Act, which was introduced and passed by the Sheikh Abdullah government in 1950, which provided land rights to the tillers, land rights to the farmers who have been toiling very hard on the land, but with very small returns or with negligible returns. So this included, they have tried to take a credit that they have provided 790,000 people with land and titles, proprietary rights, and then most of the people, more than 500,000 people, included the people from scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, and 400,000 belonged to Jammu region. I think it was a big achievement in the line for empowerment of the people who happened tilling the lands, who became landless farmers, that they owned the land and they were given a sort of, say, identity. So that is one major reason that land is very near to emotional attachment for the people of Jammu and Kashmir. And this is unique this was unique in India at that particular point of time, because this was followed by land reforms in Kerala sometime in 1956, in Punjab partially in 1961 or 1958, and then in Bengal towards the beginning of, say, 1956, 57, and fully implemented in 1960s onwards. This was being seen as an example for the empowerment of the people. So this was also becoming a threat to the idea of a federally administered India, where every state should have a sort of, say, autonomy in terms of land reforms, in terms of distribution of resources, to cover the gap between the rich and the poor. And then another thing connected with this was the debt reconciliation, that any person, any landless person having taken any loan, either from the landlord, from any financial institution, including the cooperative banks, J&K Bank, or any other institution, was written off, and the government took the responsibility to pay for the bad loans or something like that. But then again, there was a provision that people will have a house. Like in Jammu and Kashmir, there was no homelessness, for the reason that everybody was entitled to a house. And then if you have built a house, whether it's a temporary, permanent, or whatever be the case, no power in Jammu and Kashmir government has the authority to demolish your house. And 2,700 square feet of land, which was always left open. What is happening now with the change of laws? They are trying to demolish houses of the people under one pretext or the other, terming it as land encroachment, belonging the and the houses which are being demolished are being described as not only encroachments, but also the people belonging to a mafia, which is trying to control the land. This is very unfortunate. And as of today, we are seeing homelessness of the people. And then under the new laws established, like Jammu and Kashmir Bank was entitled or having the power and the mandate, being a state subject bank, that they will take over, the bank will take over all the bad debt, bad loans of the people and pay to the other banks where the things have not been very bright, or they have gone down, or the people have suffered losses, because the J&K Bank's mandate was to protect the house and income generating unit of the people. That has been taken away, and it's going to be very unfortunate, because the banks from India, the scheduled banks who have extended loans, or if they have gone bad or something like that, now it has the power, the banks have the power to take over the property, auction it, and do not care about the house or the income generating unit of the people. And then Raju had raised a point last time also, that we have to have a some sort of talk about the minerals. Like I was making an example, like in 2019, when there was a communication blockade of whole of Jammu and Kashmir, the tenders were floated for minor minerals in September 2019, and the entire process was completed online by the end of September 2019, when not even a single person from Jammu and Kashmir was having an access to file or compete at the national level or file an online tender for minor minerals. And what has happened? Somehow, out of the total 51 contractors, only one is a local person. And that person also filed the tender from New Delhi or somewhere else. And 50 contractors for minor minerals are outsiders, and 48 belong to Gujarat. And only one is from Punjab and one from Delhi. That's very unfortunate. And the same situation is continuing as of today. These minor minerals are used in construction work, road buildings, and everything. And in Jammu and Kashmir, people, particularly in rural areas, even in urban areas, they have an access to minor minerals for building their own houses. And nobody would ask any question if you are using that material for the construction of your own house, whether it is permanent, whether it is temporary, or something like that. And similarly, there has been some sort of noise over lithium deposits in Jammu and Kashmir. It's nothing new. There are many minerals in Jammu and Kashmir which have been identified, but due to ecological reasons, for environmental reasons, or not to fiddle with the fragile ecology of Jammu and Kashmir, these minerals have never been exploited, because it will hurt the ecology, fragile ecology of whole of Jammu and Kashmir to such an extent that it will be beyond repair. That was the reason. But now, like, the special status has been taken away and everything, and now the minerals have been nationalized. Whether the government in Delhi allots it to somebody else or not is not known. And then there's a question of, regarding the reference made to Satyapal Malik's comments about Pulwama. I don't think that he has done a service by doing all these things, but he has made some exposure of how the things have been going bad in Jammu and Kashmir since the beginning of 2019. Like, he made comments about Pulwama explosion, in which 40 precious lives were lost, and then what has happened, and what was described as a surgical strike of the government in Pakistan. Whatever has happened, there is no independent confirmation what has happened or how the things have taken place. And then the education profile, I have already spoken about it, that the Human Development Index in Jammu and Kashmir has been better than the rest of India. Even as of now, despite all these disturbances, the education has been given a top priority. Health and social welfare, which are the things which that are being looked down upon by the present government. And then there is a big noise about attracting investments post 2019 to the extent of 60,000 crore rupees, which is close to, say, $8 to $9 billion. I don't think anything has happened. Only recently, we don't have any independent source to confirm it, but what is being announced by the government is that a close to, say, $60 to $70 million investment has come, that too in announcements, but nothing has appeared on the ground, and it's very difficult to ascertain it. And then the question comes to, like, Arthur will bear me out, that we have become a embodiment of no freedom press. Like, there is an enforced silence. Apart from that, there is a systematic approach to it. I think they have just created a sort of, say, example in Jammu and Kashmir where entire media has been silenced. Now it is, when we were trying to raise this point before the other media persons in India, they were not listening, or I think they did not have the judgment how it is going to go away and how it is going to impact the press, not only in Jammu and Kashmir, but also rest of India. Today, the same model is being applied in rest of India in silencing the press, in silencing the criticism of the government, in silencing any questions raised about the governance, raised about the crony capitalism, raised about how the money has been misappropriated by the government, and how the government does not want to say anything, does not want to answer any question. I think I will close it here. Thank you, Raju. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabodh. There's a lot packed in your remarks in terms of how the laws before and after 370 are affecting the majority community in Kashmir. Thank you. With that, since you already introduced the idea of press freedoms, let me pass the baton to Kalpana ji.
Thank you, Raju, and good morning, everyone from Bombay. I think both Professor Zia and Mr. Jamwal have actually set the scene on the issue of the extent of freedom or unfreedom of the press in Kashmir. And I'm not based in Kashmir, so I think what they say has this sort of granular feel, which I certainly cannot add to. I think the fact, I just underline a couple of important things. One, that Professor Zia said about the fact that censorship already existed in Kashmir, but that now it has been systematized. I think that's the key to understanding the issues around press freedom in Kashmir and in India. I also thought it was interesting that Mr. Jamwal talked about how Jammu and Kashmir had set an example on so many levels, especially, for instance, on the issue of land reforms. And oddly enough, what has happened since 2019, as far as the press is concerned, in a sense, Jammu and Kashmir is like the petri dish for this government, where it has worked on how to ensure that the press is both controlled and silenced without actually bringing in the kind of direct censorship that we had during the emergency. So once again, it is Jammu and Kashmir, unfortunately, that is setting the reverse kind of example, not the good example that it did with land reforms. From my understanding of what is happening in Kashmir, I have not been there for some time. It is through my contacts with particularly women journalists. And I'll just explain, as a journalist, when you're functioning in this kind of situation, again, I think Mr. Jamwal is better placed to give examples on this. But for young women journalists who are doing terrific work earlier and writing for Indian papers as well as papers outside the country. Now they are finding it increasingly difficult to get any kind of outlet within India. Most of them have to write outside. As a result, what they write is not read in here. Also, it's like being on the tenterhook because you don't know at what point what you have written will result in your being summoned to a police station. Recently, a young woman who had done a very good story last year on the widows of Kashmir and the problems they have in accessing what they're entitled to, found that she had won an award for the story, but her passport was not clear. The police verification didn't come through. She thought she would not be able to go. It came through at the very last minute. Then when she did get ready to go, went to Delhi in order to take a flight, she found that her name was on the no-fly list. Again, there was no way of her knowing whether it was or was not. She spent frustrating more than 12 hours at the airport trying to figure out how to get off it or how to negotiate. She finally managed to negotiate and went and collected the award. But this is the sort of routine thing that is happening. And I think for a journalist, if you live with this kind of thing hanging over your head, it's almost impossible to function in any environment. So we have to understand that what is happening in Kashmir is at so many levels that journalism as it is expected to be done cannot be done under those circumstances. And I'll give you another, this story of the minerals, for instance, that Mr. Jamwal has just mentioned. Now, that's the kind of story that ought to have appeared in all our newspapers about what is happening in Kashmir. Even a story like that, which has nothing to do directly with, politics and all the other things that are going on, will not be reported. That is the amazing thing. So we are not getting news about what is happening in Kashmir in the rest of India, except for tourism, when there is any visit by any, big personality, or some amount of local politics, so to speak, which again, of course, has been kept in abeyance. But the real stories of what people are going through, no, nothing at all appears. You can scan through newspapers, and I'm talking only about print because I choose not to watch Indian television news, which has become a joke, which is not news in any sense that I have known news to be in my 50 years as a journalist. And I think Mr. Jamwal is also right that what has happened in Kashmir post 2019, as far as the press is concerned, is exactly what is now happening in the rest of the country. And, at that time in 2019, many more journalists in India ought to have woken up to this and protested and drawn attention to the fact that if something like this systemized way of controlling the press can be instituted in one state of India, there is nothing stopping this government from doing the same all over India. And that is precisely what has happened. And now finally people sort of are waking up. And I would say, again, it's a much smaller, it's small minority. It is certainly not all of the press. And I'm speaking specifically of the media policy that was instituted in Kashmir, where the government has the right to decide what will or what will not go into publication or be telecast or broadcast. And they can declare anything that they find basically critical as misleading or even fake or false, anything to do with the government. Now, exactly that has now been brought into India. Exactly that kind of amendment has been brought to the information and technology rules. A fact-checking unit has been set up by the union government. At the moment, it's been kept in abeyance till July, thanks to a case that has been filed by the comedian Kunal Kamra in the Bombay High Court. But there's no saying that it will not happen, but it's precisely the same thing. Anything that is written that criticizes a government program or a government policy, the fact-checking unit can decide that it is misleading or false or fake, and can insist that all internet and social media platforms such as Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, etc., take it down. Now, it may not affect print directly because print is still alive in India despite the growth of television and internet, and so those articles will still appear in print. But largely now, people are accessing news through their computers and more through mobile phones. So therefore, the need to put these out on the internet has become very important, not just for legacy media, but of course, critically for the digital news platforms, which are the only spaces left now where some kind of critical reporting can take place. Much of this will be completely crippled because it means that none of this can be reported. And if it is, it will be taken down and other things will happen. So, to me, it is extraordinary that in 2019, we didn't wake up to it. And I think part of the reason, I believe, is because, press freedom is not an issue that people get excited about in India. I mean, some of us do because we are journalists and we talk about it. Some of us who've been through the emergency particularly and have known the impact of direct censorship when you're working as a journalist, feel even more passionately about it and feel that it is important. But by and large, you talk to people, they're not so interested. It's not one of these hot issues that people get worked up about. What the media does wake up to is when journalists are either beaten up or when they're arrested. So Kashmir, that's become almost a norm to be detained, to be arrested, to be called to the police station for questioning. In India now, it's becoming that way. I mean, the other night, a young woman, Sakshi Joshi, went to cover what was happening at the ongoing protests by our champion wrestlers on the issue of sexual harassment, where they have charged the man who heads the Wrestlers Federation of India with sexual harassment, and they're demanding that he be arrested. This woman went with a camera to record what was going on there because the police were not allowing them to bring in dry mattresses just because their mattresses had become wet because of the unseasonal rains. She was roughed up by the police. She was detained for doing what was her job as a journalist. Yesterday or day before, another young woman actually working with a main channel, Times Now, in Punjab was detained when she went to do some reporting. So now more and more this is becoming an issue where any journalist, even doing their job of recording something which the government doesn't want to be doesn't want any record of, may face this kind of detention. Nothing on the level that journalists in Kashmir go through at this point, but you never know in India. The other thing I would just want to say that I think we have to have a perspective of what has been happening anyway earlier. And I think that, again, I refer to Professor Zia's point that censorship has been there, if not censorship, let's say control of the media has been there in many ways in India anyway from the beginning. I don't think any government welcomes a media that's really free, that's really critical, that really goes at it. And they find ways and means to ensure that they are kept quiet to some extent, even if some kind of freedom is guaranteed under the law. And this is in many countries, not just in India. But, and I think in India, in earlier regimes, those of us who've been journalists for long enough will remember that things like control of newsprint, for instance, at a time that there was only print, was in the hands of the government. And they used it to put pressure on especially some of the bigger papers. Post 1990 and liberalization, the corporate sector began to put pressure on the media in terms of coverage because they held the advertising, and advertising became very important for newspapers once some newspapers had decided that the media has the possibility of becoming a profit center. That is, it can earn enough money on its own through advertising and therefore make huge profits for itself as a company. Once that became the criteria that decided what is or is not news, the whole distortion took place. It became determined by how to ensure that you did not lose advertising, that you did not annoy your corporate bosses. So I've worked with mainstream media in all of them. There were certain areas that were a no-go. There's nothing written, but any of us who were either reporting or even senior within the organization knew this. And therefore, there was this kind of self-censorship. The same thing about owners cozying up to certain politicians, to certain political parties. Again, there was a kind of informal understanding that these things, you do not push the envelope too far. But even within that, those constraints, there was still a lot of reporting, and especially post the emergency. I think the Indian media went through, I would call, a golden period in the 80s, when, because of the deprival of press rights, freedom rights in during the emergency, all newspapers really went at stories of human rights deprivation, of social issues, of environmental issues. We had, for the first time, really solid environmental reporting, especially post the Bhopal tragedy. I mean, if you look at the newspapers of the 1980s and you look at them today, you would not believe that it's still the same media, that it is the same newspapers. So what has happened? You know, and in the World Press Freedom Index, as many of you may be aware, the latest index came out and India is placed at 161 out of 180 countries. Last year, it was 150. So it's fallen 11 points in 1 year. What has happened? What has happened for this precipitous fall? I would say that a number of things have happened, but again, it's been a process which has been accelerated post 2014, where I think the very concept of what is a free press has been whittled down and hollowed out to such an extent that I think we'll have to re-articulate now what we mean when we say there has to be a free press in a democracy, because I think even that a whole generation has grown up consuming a kind of media that is so uncritical that I don't think they even know that that is what the media ought to be in a democracy. So, you know, people keep saying, oh, India has hundreds of newspapers, thousands, in fact, of newspapers and other publications, and hundreds of TV channels that are privately owned. And therefore, it is a vibrant and plural media scene. But, you know, the numbers do not speak of press freedom. The ownership of many of these are held in very few hands, and they are the ones who are determining with the government in power. And if the government of the day decides to use whatever levers it has to ensure that its narrative is carried by the majority of the media, that is what happens. And that is what we have seen through 2014. You may have many important issues that the media ought to be covering. You know, in a country like this, we still have appalling statistics on child malnutrition, on infant mortality, on maternal mortality. But the kind of stories that we did have in the 80s and the 90s, we see them only rarely now, only when there's a huge disaster. Environment, forget it. You know, it's as if industries have stopped polluting. It's as if we're living in a pristine environment. It's only because the media is based in cities that we have some stories about pollution, air pollution in our cities. But forests are being taken over. Mining has given way, you know, has been given the priority. There are huge environmental challenges that this country faces, but very little of that appears in the media. And a critical survey of the many programs that the government keeps boasting of every day through full-page advertisements is rare to find. You know, once in a while you'll see it, but certainly not in mainstream media. Most often in the few independent spaces that remain, which are the digital news platforms like The Wire, Scroll, The News Minute, etc. That is where you'll find the information. And once in a while, yes, in the big newspapers like the Indian Express, for instance, which has done some of these stories, the Tribune, the Deccan Herald, the Telegraph, etc. So, but to come back to the why there's been this precipitous fall in the last year, one, of course, is, as I said, this same rule that was in Jammu and Kashmir is now sought to be brought in for the media all across India. The second is the fact that now this government doesn't seem to care what the rest of the world thinks about whether the media in India is free or not. And therefore, you know, the ban on the BBC film, which was not going to be seen in India in any case, is a case in point. This two-part series was made by the BBC. It was called India, the Modi Question. And I think that is the point. Because they called it the Modi Question. That is the reason where they decided that nothing will be seen in India. And the first part, of course, was about Gujarat, which is sought to be literally erased from our memories. Gujarat 2002 and what happened. And because Narendra Modi is central to what happened, more so that will be erased forever. And I think that is one of those things that caught international attention in the way that was done. But that's the more spectacular, on a day-to-day basis, all the time, these kind of threats, as I said, are given. Journalists who are working on trying to do cutting-edge journalism are finding it increasingly difficult to get published in India, to find the outlets who will be willing to take a risk to finance them to do the kind of stories they want to do. And therefore, you find that more and more, most media outlets will not have these kind of cutting-edge stories. The other issue is one of revenue, whereas in the 90s and the 2000s, a lot of the revenue for many newspapers came also from the private sector, from the corporate sector, and from the government sector in manufacturing. Now, increasingly, it's become a party and government advertising. That was the stable for the smaller publications earlier, who depended entirely on government advertising. Now, if you look at any newspaper today, you will find full-page ads from various governments as well as the central government. And I think the need not to lose this advertising for a majority of the print newspapers. There are a couple of them that still grab most of the private advertising, and their revenue model, they continue to make profit. For the majority of the people in print now, it's very difficult to make ends meet. And therefore, they play this strange balancing game where they will go a little far and then they will pull back. On their editorial pages, they will give free rein to people from government, even ministers, to write all kinds of things that are often inaccurate and untrue, but they go onto the edit page. They violate the principal policy of an edit page that an article that is written for an edit page should be exclusive to that newspaper. So you'll have Narendra Modi writing an article. He has not written that article, which will be reproduced in all the newspapers verbatim on their edit pages. I mean, this is not a free press, when you have things like this happening. And more, let me just give, to conclude, more recently, 3 examples that will illustrate, in a sense, for people who may be not in India and cannot fathom what is happening to our so-called vibrant press that was there. Recently, a couple of months ago, the Hindenburg report was released, and it exposed what Adani, who's the richest man in India, whose company has investments across the board in infrastructure, in mining, and much else, the kind of fiddles that were going on basically by him and by his companies. The report was mentioned and was reported in most newspapers. They had to, it was too big a story. But since then, there has been no follow-up. And this is the biggest business story we've had in years. And yet, what is the Indian press doing? We should be the ones who should be following up. In fact, this is a story that ought to have been broken by India and not by a short seller outside India. And yet, there has been no follow-up. So this speaks to the kind of self-censorship that goes on, where certain areas are no-go, that they have decided themselves that they will not investigate. And in Adani's case, it is now well known that he's very close to Narendra Modi, has been ever since his star started rising in the early 2000s from Gujarat, when he was a very small businessman, post the earthquake in Kutch, for instance. And he's risen, in a most dramatic way to becoming one of the richest men in the world. But that's a story that surely should pique the curiosity of any business journalist in India. And yet, even if some journalists have got the material to write that kind of story, it is not being written, and it has not been written. Then take the case which Mr. Bhasin also mentioned about Satyapal Malik. Satyapal Malik's interviews, which he of course gave only to the digital media platforms like The Wire and to Ravish Kumar and another. I mean, they're explosive in the sense that he raised issues about Pulwama, where he directly said that the Prime Minister had told him not to speak up, and to say that the Home Ministry had refused to send the planes that were needed to take these troops from Jammu to Kashmir without having to go by road. That's a pretty big explosive statement to be made by a man who was at that point the governor of Jammu and Kashmir. Yet, if you scan the newspapers and, of course, forget television, television has tried to, of course, downplay this by, calling out Satyapal Malik for things that that questions his credibility. But what actually happened in Pulwama, we still don't know. And nobody has investigated. And surely this is a story that ought to be investigated. And in any other country with a really free press, that ought to have been investigated. As a contrast, let me give you another side, which actually reminds me very much of the emergency. Because in the emergency, not only were there silences and areas where we simply could not write, but there was pressure that we had to write on certain things. We had to write on how great the 20-point program was of Mrs. Gandhi. We had to write on how great Sanjay Gandhi was with his five-point program and all the ideas he had about population control. So, recently, Man Ki Baat, which is the monthly monologue by our Prime Minister, completed 100 episodes. So this was front page news everywhere. Nobody asked, why is this an achievement? Here's a prime minister who loves to talk, who has government media at his beck and call, and he decides that he's going to use it to communicate to the public. There's also diktat from government that all private channels should also relay this so that the reach is amplified. And he does 100 episodes. I mean, would he not have done 100 episodes? But surely, again, a free press would show a little bit of skepticism about, okay, they celebrated 100 episodes, but what is the achievement? So, no, of course, there's no word. And if you ask those questions, you know what you're called. You're called anti-national. But I would see that kind of skepticism as an absolute basic and essential part of being a journalist in a country where press freedom ought to be guaranteed. These things have gone. So it's within the silences and within the excessive writing on certain things that you see the true picture of where it is a tragedy. I don't know how we will pull this back, but it's been an incremental and slow process. As a result, many in the media also are not fully awake and angry enough.
Kalpana ji, your audio has stopped, if you can hear us. Yeah, they must. Okay. We'll give it a second. Yeah, Prabodh. Oh, there you are.
I don't know what happened to my link. Yeah. So anyway, just to conclude that, I think this is the trouble, that it's been so incremental that I think people have not fully understood. And even this World Press Freedom Index coming up with us at 161, it's amazing. I mean, surely in the media, there should be some discussion about this. How has India fallen 11 points in 1 year? What is it that has happened? But till today, I have not seen a single article looking at this, either questioning it or pointing out that this is really alarming and this is something we should do something about. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kalpana ji, for that really perspective going back several decades and the what has happened to press freedom imperceptibly to maybe ordinary people and where it is right now. And it's scary. When you talked about self-censorship, what occurred to me is all of us here in the US hold Pramila Jayapal as perhaps a progressive congresswoman who really understands what's happening in India and has and wants to do something about it. And yet when this Press Freedom Index came, what she chose to highlight was not what's happening to India. What she chose to highlight, and I saw that yesterday, was that the US had fallen 3 or 4 in number and how dangerous it is and how scary it is. So she had to say something. She would have loved to say it about India, but self-censorship must have come into play here, where she then talked only about the US. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions from the audience, and one is with the name Saeed Shahid. It's a question for Professor Ather. There are a few reports that Urdu poetry is being used to register resistance in Kashmir. How can we access this poetry? And I think he's asking that question of you. You're being a poet, besides being an activist and an academic. Would you like to answer that question, Professor Zia?
Yeah, is it okay to answer that question? And then there's another question by an anonymous attendee.
Yeah, sure. Let me read that out. I was going to go to that next. This was actually a first question, and because it was anonymous, I gave him second priority, him or her. But it's a very important question because it really captures what many people in India, including our family and friends, would say. And here is his question, or her question. Article 370 was intended to remain effective until the Jammu and Kashmir Constitution was framed, and thereafter the article was to be deemed to be ineffective. So in this person's view, what happened in 5th of August 2019 has set right the continuing anomaly.
No, Article 370 was to be in effect till plebiscite was held, till right of self-determination was, and this is if we kind of like argue for the fleeing colonial powers, Mountbatten, this was written into it. So it wasn't till Constitution. That's kind of a very contrary to what Article 370 itself is. So it came into effect and in 1949, and so I don't want to kind of go into that deep detailed history, but it was to be in effect the way it was till plebiscite was held, not till it was framed. What kind of a contrary situation is that? And then another anonymous attendee, maybe it's the same. They say, why we talk in binary since I think it's supposed to be my name. Position suggests that things have to be looked from a partisan frame of history. No. And its interpretation, no, it has to be looked at holistic, not just the Indian narrative. Especially the Kashmiri narrative is completely gone out of the situation. So I think it's very important that Kashmiri narratives that have been written from 1947 onwards and even before, they be taken into consideration. And then, of course, the Pakistani narratives, and then the Indian narratives, and then we look at it. It's not, I'm not talking about partisan frame. What I was doing was I was presenting what the Kashmiri, majority Kashmiri. I'm not talking on behalf of Pandits, nor am I talking on behalf of majority Muslims, so to speak. I'm talking on behalf of what my research is. So that it's a completely incomplete picture of history that has been presented. So it's not partisan. I'm trying to fill that gap. That's what critical Kashmir studies is about. And it's a sub-discipline for the last 2 decades, which is filling those gaps slowly and steadily. And which is why India is really sort of incinerated because of this. I mean, it's not a big deal. Kashmiris are suffering great tragedies. It's a small risk and it's a small price to pay. People like me have a ban on Twitter, which is due to the legal demand in India, because the kind of things that we are saying, writing are not palatable to India, mostly. So I'm not talking about partisan interpretation of history. I'm talking about filling in the gaps of what was left and why the hegemonic Indian narrative has become so predominant in the last 72 years. It's very important to pay attention to that. So regarding the Kashmiri, regarding the poetry, I will tackle that question, but there were several things that I wanted to speak to. One was, as Kalpana ji and Prabodh ji have talked about, there is a disappearing archive in Kashmir at this moment. Since 2014, the magazine, the webzine that I founded, Kashmir Lit, in 2016, it began to pick up. I received requests from people to take down their articles, even poetry Poetry usually is not seen as overtly political, even though it is political. But a lot of poetry and a lot of articles, every week I used to get several requests for people wanting their writings to be deleted, writings to be taken down from the site. So what I actually did very recently was symbolically put an empty page there, because I could not have, deleted pages and empty pages. So I put a symbolically empty page and also wrote a short editorial about these disappearing archives. And it's not just from Kashmir Lit, it's from the regular newspapers. And I think Kashmir Times will bear me out there. And journalists who have reported on the human rights violations, which doesn't present India in that positive light, they have had their entire archives wiped out. So that's what we are also facing. And I think this question that about Urdu poetry is being used to register resistance, I think English poetry as well, Kashmiri poetry is also registering resistance, so to speak. But the problem is that people are very wary of either keeping it alive somewhere, even in the internets and interwebs, but it's also not being published in the local newspapers. People are very wary. Very recently, a poet did not want his book to be featured on Kashmir Lit, because they thought, it might be sort of like a mode of persecution for him, because I think he was looking for a government job, and the background checks that they're doing, even if there is a minor form of dissidence. Dissidence is usually the juice of democracy, and that's kind of, and I don't really believe India has democracy. It's a settler democracy in India, and the Westphalian Eurocentric democracy that it's imposing on its own people has a very necropolitical order, which is why what's happening inside India is becoming the norm. So, but for the Urdu poetry, I don't know where you would access it. I mean, Kashmir Lit doesn't publish Urdu poetry a lot. We do publish a lot of translations. And then there are people who are publishing, so maybe there are some regular archives somewhere that you might be able to, but I don't know if there are any global archives anywhere.
May I ask Kalpana ji and Prabodh if they have any comments on the question that was addressed by Professor Zia before we go to the next question? Prabodh? Okay, the next question is from Geeta Bamizai. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. In Kashmir, you get overwhelmed with the sense of self-persecution when the entire system since 1930s was tilted to set up an Islamic dispensation, since Muslim League was preparing base for religious representation in the assemblies. I don't know what the question is, but if any of the panelists would like to respond, please do so. I think there's an implication here, perhaps Kashmiris are, I don't know how to have a sense of self-persecution, which kind of implies that there may be no real persecution. I don't want to put words in this person's mouth, but that's the way I read it. But please feel free to respond. Any other panelists?
Well, I don't know how to really answer this question, because, what's happening in India right now is kind of like the Hindutva, supremacist Hindutva dispensation that's kind of unfolding. It does happen when you have sort of a majority religion, kind of, the population is following a certain religion, you will have a representation from that religion. So the mode of fear that was present in those days, which is also what led to the creation of two countries. So I would kind of like, I don't know what is actually being said in the question. But what you see happening in Kashmir right now, Prabodh already laid down the discrimination against a majority Muslim population that's happening, that they don't have their representatives, they don't have their bureaucrats, they don't have their police, everything is subservient to the Babus from India. And then if we go back to 1930s, we also look at the the discrimination against Muslims, even during that era. Glancy Commission was the commission that was set up to look into those discriminations, which is why later on you kind of also have a Pandit uprising against Glancy Commission. So if you want to get into that, it's a lot of history, and I don't know if we have time for that. But I think what's really being implied in this is, one, that there is a self-persecution, and the other is Islamic dispensation. It's almost like, I think, the way Kashmiri resistance has been criminalized, the way it has been overtly made into this Islamic dispensation. I think that's something, there might be an Islamic hue to it, and because majority of the people who are dealing with this are Muslims, and there is this sense, and Prabodh earlier talked about the autonomy. I'm not a great votary of what the autonomy was, or Article 370, because I think it was a hogwash. It's a Trojan horse which was brought inside Kashmir, which also brought laws from India, especially the Fundamental Rights Charter, which enabled persecution, especially administrative detention, which was imposed on Kashmiris, and criminalization of Kashmiri resistance started right from that moment onwards. What exactly happens in 2019 is that the autonomy was made into this Islamic patriarchal virulent setup, which was also made to show the rest of the world as if it was doing gender discrimination, it was doing terrorism, it was doing nepotism. So, it's kind of, this question kind of stems from that kind of thinking, I feel like. So, but we have to look into history to kind of see what exactly is happening against Muslims at that time, what's happening to the Pandits, and what's happening to the other minorities. And also we have to kind of like slightly change our lens. Rather than always thinking about partition, we think as if India was this huge country that kind of goes, it was like a land, but it was not this landmass. Nation states are a very recent concept. So it was different principalities, different kingdoms. It was British India, which came within the British Dominion, and it was British India and princely states that was kind of created into this one big dominion, from which you have what is the current India and Pakistan. And also thinking about, connected to this is also thinking about post-colonialism. Post-colonialism assumes that countries have been made. Now the colonialism is post. But when you look at situations like Kashmir, colonialism is not post. Colonialism is unfolding right in this very minute. You kind of see India as a new imperial power in Kashmir. As we are talking about extractive settler colonialism, just yesterday, I don't know, Prabodh can bear us out, but there is this order that's circulating in WhatsApp. So it's a WhatsApp university. So I don't know if it's a news yet. It says that not for public circulation, but then it's circulated in public. So I don't know whether this is right or wrong, whether it's some kind of a fake order, which shows that the mining has been given to an Israeli company. So you kind of see extractive settler colonialism in action, especially when you look at it from within the Kashmiri vantage. And I take all the minorities into consideration there. I'm not saying it's only a problem of Muslims, the settler colonialism. It's also the problem of Pandits. It's also the problem of Sikhs and other minorities that live inside Kashmir. And I think all communities have to look at it from their angle. If they really don't want this extractive capitalism and extractive settler colonialism, and highlighting them completely, which it is doing in Kashmir. And I think it's loss for both communities and loss for other communities as well.
We have,
and then there's the last question. I don't know if it's to me, so you might want to read that and maybe we can answer that.
Yeah, I'm skipping the next two because they're not really questions, they're really statements. And I made it very clear that I would like specific questions for the panelists. But the last question by Zara Khan is why India does not want to give Kashmir freedom and make its own constitution. Question. It's a question mark. So let's end with that question if anybody wants to answer that.
I think I answered enough questions. Maybe Prabodh and Kalpana can talk about why India, because I know India from the other vantage. So
Prabodh?
maybe Kalpana.
Yeah, I think she has answered the question. So there is no more scope. extending the debate or something like that, but this can be taken up sometime later. So these are some of
Thank
the
you.
things
We are at
do not require
7:30.
any answer.
And if any of the panelists would like to make any last final statement, please feel free. We can afford to go a couple of minutes extra. But thank you, by the way, for appearing and to talk about this difficult issue. Difficult issue only because I think that not enough time has been spent to understand the real issues in Kashmir. And I've learned a lot since Anuradha and Prabodh came to the Bay Area, working with them. I've learned a lot. So I think we are still in the learning mode, those of us that who do not live either in India or have connections with Kashmir. So thank you so much for giving us a lot of food for thought. So if you have any final comments, please go ahead.
No, thank you.
All right. Thank you all very much. Please do attend our future Desh-Videsh conversations. Just to quickly say, the idea of Desh-Videsh is simply that we should stop speaking at our echo chambers and try to encourage people with different points of view to come and join, as long as we all follow rules of civic engagement. And that's been the case in all the seminars that we've had so far. And I think maybe it's a beginning of some level of dialogue, at least in the diaspora, that we're hoping to encourage. Thank you, Professor Zia. Thank you, Kalpana ji, and thank you, Prabodh. And thanks everyone who joined. And have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.